So I actually have the privilege to introduce a guest speaker for us today. Her name is Dr. Sally Baxter. And so Dr. Baxter is a physician and informaticist integrating comprehensive ophthalmic care with research investigation and big data, artificial intelligence, and health information technology systems. She is actually the first ophthalmologist to receive an NIH Office of Directors Early Independence Award and was recognized in Ophthalmology Management's 40 Under 40 list. Dr. Baxter is the Chief of Division of Ophthalmology Informatics and Data Science at the University of California, San Diego, Chair of Data Standards Work Group at the American Academy of Ophthalmology, member of the AAO or American Academy of Ophthalmology Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and co-lead of the Observational Health Data Scientists and Informatics Work Group. She is the PI of multiple grant-funded research studies and training programs and has over 80 scientific publications. She is double board certified in both ophthalmology and clinical informatics, and she was part of the alpha demonstration project phase for the All of Us and was one of the first investigators to publish a clinical research study using data from the All of Us after its public release. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sally Baxter.
Thanks so much, Gage, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your Friday to join us today. Let me go ahead and start my slideshow here and share screen. Great. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about using All of Us for research in ophthalmology, and this is my particular area. As Gage mentioned, I'm clinically trained as an ophthalmologist, but I'd also do some work that's a little bit broader than ophthalmology and kind of generally within informatics. But I'm hopeful that this will be useful to you, even if you're not in ophthalmology, to get familiar with the types of analyses that we've done, and hopefully be able to apply some of that to your own area if you're not specifically in ophthalmology or vision research. So these are my disclosures. I'm highlighting my DP5 award from NIH Office of the Director, since that has been the one that has primarily funded my work with the All of Us research program. But I do have some commercial disclosures, just mostly equipment and a one-time consulting thing for which I'm still in the window to report. But none of these are related to the talk that I'm giving today. So what we'll do is I'll give some examples of the studies that I've done using data from All of Us. I'd like to talk a little bit about strengths and limitations of All of Us for ophthalmic research. And again, because it is a little bit of a subspecialty area, some of this might be specifically applicable to ophthalmology, but there are some, I think, broader lessons to be learned and hopefully ways that these can inform future directions and opportunities for the program as well. So I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with background on the All of Us research program, but in case you're not, it is a nationwide prospective cohort study aiming to enroll 1 million individuals throughout the United States. There is an emphasis on diverse enrollment and enrolling folks from communities that have been traditionally underrepresented in biomedical research. And I think that's truly been one of the greatest advantages of working with this data source, and certainly something, in ophthalmology, where some of our conditions really do disproportionately affect, communities who have not been well represented in research. And so this was really a great way to address that issue and be able to study those populations, because they're the ones that can be more often affected by many of our most prevalent eye conditions. There's a range of data that are available in All of Us, including survey data, electronic health record data, physical measurements, wearables, and biospecimens, and so forth. So it's a really rich resource to be able to link across some of those data types. I'll talk a bit about some of the work that we've done looking at those different categories of data. And again, this is probably familiar to many of you, but there is enrollment in All of Us from across the country. I think it's been great to see it grow over time. As Gage mentioned, I was in the alpha demonstration phase, which was an early phase of users just validating the data and replicating previously conducted studies. And from then, which was back in 2018, 2019 timeframe till now, the growth has been very impressive. And I think of note the fact that over half of the enrolled participants are from racial ethnic minority populations, and also over 80% underrepresented biomedical research. If you use a broader definition of diversity, it really, again, just highlights the success of the program and really reaching out to communities who might not have been well represented in research previously. So I'm going to jump into a project that we did. And this is actually my alpha demonstration project, the project that first got me started with all of us. And this was looking at the connections between systemic disease and glaucoma. So glaucoma is the world's leading cause of irreversible blindness. It essentially involves a degeneration of the optic nerve, which is the structure that connects your eye to your brain. And with damage to the optic nerve over time, the visual field, which is sort of the area of vision that you can see, starts to decrease down. And then it can lead to total blindness. And the worst part of it is that because the damage often affects the outer parts of the vision first, it may not be noticeable. So it's often asymptomatic for many of our patients, and they don't realize that they have the disease. By the time they see vision changes, it often is quite advanced and too late. And once the damage has been done, you can't really reverse it. So it's a little bit different than some of our other conditions. For example, cataracts, which is a cloudy lens in the eye. You can have very bad vision from cataracts, but with a 10-15 minute surgery, we can take someone from essentially being blind to being 20/20 in some cases. And glaucoma is very different because once the damage has been inflicted, because it is, essentially a neurodegenerative condition of the optic nerve, it really, at this point in time, we don't have ways of reversing. And another thing that is unique about glaucoma is that there are sort of an interplay between the disease and the rest of the body. So again, I'll take cataract as a point of contrast. It tends to be isolated to the eye, although it can also reflect underlying systemic disease. But glaucoma is very much intimately connected with the rest of the body. There are certain different frameworks for thinking about pathophysiology or development of glaucoma, and some of these are biomechanical factors of the eye. But there's a whole framework that includes looking at vascular conditions and blood flow. And so if you think of the optic nerve as, if it doesn't have good perfusion, doesn't have good blood flow, it can undergo damage and cause vision to be lost. And so really understanding how systemic diseases like, hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, cardiovascular disease in general relates to risk of glaucoma is a really active area of investigation. But when you look at clinical practice, a lot of the times as ophthalmologists, we're seeing patients in the clinic and we're not necessarily able to spend the time needed to really dig into the entire systemic history. And in some cases, that data may be not always readily available or in our interfaces, which are mostly focused on the eye exam. And so the root of this question was around whether we could have clinical decision support and develop models to be able to identify patients at high risk for glaucoma based on things like their blood pressure and other risk factors. And in order to do that, we would need to have high-performing predictive models that take those systemic attributes and then can predict their risk of glaucoma progression. And so that was kind of the underlying question for this project. And so the idea here was that we had done some of this model training and testing with single center data, so data from our institution at the University of California, San Diego. But we wanted to use the data from all of us as an external validation cohort. And so, in AIML, I think there's a lot of concerns around reproducibility and generalizability. And, certainly for us, as we were trying to come up with models that may potentially be used in supporting clinicians and identifying high-risk patients, we wanted to make sure that our models would work across diverse populations and not just work for our local population. And so this is a great opportunity to do that. And I think in general, this is a great use of the All of Us data, is that it can serve as an external validation cohort for AI models that have been developed using other data. And then the second goal we were trying to do is to actually use the All of Us data as a training cohort and develop new models, and then compare the performance of those models to the original single center model. And then finally, because we were, sort of in this, our group was among this smaller group of initial sort of pilot users, we wanted to be able to share insights about our experience with All of Us, with other ophthalmologists and vision scientists, as well as the broader research community at large. You can see at the time we did the study, the All of Us cohort was about a third of the size that it is now. So it's a much smaller cohort at that point in time. And we narrowed down our study cohort based on diagnosis codes. And again, the idea was to validate our single center model as well as training models and do some performance evaluation across those. So I do have some screenshots from the researcher Workbench. I don't know if everybody here has had experience working with it already, but I know that this has been something that's been helpful to in some of the sessions that I've done is for people to see what the interface actually looks like and how to work with it. And so in our cohort, we were looking at adults and diagnosis codes related to primary open-angle glaucoma. And you can see here on the researcher Workbench that it's a pretty easy to use interface for defining your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and you can indicate specific diagnosis codes. You can also add temporality to it as well. And, almost immediately you'll get counts and a preview of how many are in your cohort. And here are these hashes. I'm just blocking or obscuring view populations where we have less than 20 in accordance with the, sort of data sharing and dissemination policies at All of Us. But this is a great tool. I found that I've had other studies too, where sometimes we're just trying to gauge feasibility. And so, if we have our study cohort definition, it's very quick to be able to, essentially run a quick query without having to code anything. Really, this is essentially a drag and drop interface. And you get a very quick view of what your N would be and what some of the demographic characteristics would be. I've actually used this for grant proposals as well. And so I think that's kind of a lesson that's broadly applicable, not just ophthalmology, but, like when you're looking at sample sizes, feasibility of using All of Us as a data source for a particular study, or if you're putting together a grant proposal and wanting to demonstrate, that you have sufficient sample size, this is a great tool and it's super quick. And so that's one, really great benefit that I've seen with this data set. So what we did was then proceed to develop concept sets for our primary outcome of interest, which was need for glaucoma surgery or procedures. And these are indicative of, they serve as kind of a proxy for glaucoma progression, because if you're requiring surgery, it's usually a reflection that your disease is getting worse. Now, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, within ophthalmology, this is not sort of the most precise way to phenotype glaucoma progression. And typically we'll do it with visual field testing or imaging, such as fundus photos or OCTs, optical coherence tomography images, but these are not currently available in All of Us. And so, because procedure codes that's the approach that we took in order to define the outcome of interest in this particular study. And then we also looked at vital signs, physical measurements like blood pressure and heart rate, comorbid conditions, and medications. And I will say that, for example, the comorbid conditions, and we looked at diagnosis codes for hypertension and diabetes, cancer diagnoses as well, and a whole range of systemic diagnoses. And this is really a huge advantage, I think, for the All of Us database, is just the scope and the fact that it includes so much electronic health record data. And on the ophthalmology side, for example, our specialty society runs a huge clinical registry for ophthalmology patients. And I think it actually now ranks as one of the largest clinical registries in the world. It's a great resource. However, one of its drawbacks is it does not have a lot of information on systemic conditions like, the conditions I mentioned, hypertension, diabetes, and so forth. So for researchers who are interested in understanding the connections between, the rest of the body and the eye, that data source is going to be a little bit more limited. Whereas all of us has a lot more information in that regard and a lot of other data types that you can link to. So I think really, again, that's kind of a lesson that's fairly broad across all areas, is really this idea of being able to take different types of data and different domains is really powerful, and I think a unique opportunity to answer new research questions. And so once we built our cohorts and defined our concept sets, then we can spin up notebooks and analyze that data. And if anyone is interested in using our data, the data for this project is actually a published workspace on all of us. So I think if you look for systemic disease and glaucoma, you'll be able to see all our notebooks, and we have it organized into different notebooks for the initial data cleaning process and the data wrangling, how we developed the different models, and then a notebook that just has our best performing models, which lines up with what was published in our paper. And I think that's another resource that you can use, and certainly the code is sort of open and shared with all of us user, and happy to answer questions that you might have, or you can certainly access the code for your own projects as well. So the models that we trained, we use logistic regression, random forest, as well as artificial neural networks. And so I won't go into all of the details from the project, but the main takeaway was that we had much better performance. These are AUC curves, which really are a way to be able to show how well models discriminate between the outcomes. So, being able to identify patients who ended up getting glaucoma surgery versus those who didn't. And I apologize that these are the slightly different scale, but this is from our previous data from our single center. And the AUC, the area under the curve here, was around the 0.65 to 0.7 range. And typically when you look at these curves, right, you're trying to basically towards the upper left, it means, better performance. And you can see much better performance here on the all of us data, approaching, 0.9, 0.95 range. So this was a really big boost in performance. And I do think that can be attributed to, so nationwide scale, larger number of participants, certainly with greater sample size, you'll have better model performance in general. And then also the diversity, and in particular, a higher representation of women and Black patients. And these are also populations who are disproportionately affected by glaucoma and glaucoma-related blindness. So this was probably one of the biggest takeaways for us, and I think really demonstrated the power and the advantage of the All of Us program, and the nationwide scope of the data and the diversity. So before I move on, I'm happy to pause. I think something came in through the chat, so I'll take a look there for questions. Sorry. And in doing so, I accidentally stopped my slideshow. Oh, I see that Chris put in the link to the workspace. Thank you. If there aren't any questions, then I'll keep on going here, and feel free to interrupt and let me know if you do have a question that comes up. And then this is our article that resulted from this study. This was the one that was, I think, the first clinical research paper that used data from the All of Us program. So we were happy to be sort of the first. I think a big part of that was the support from the DRC during the demonstration project phase. So thanks to the team at Vanderbilt for the support during that process. But the paper obviously goes into much more detail than I was able to give during the presentation around the analysis. So since then, in the intervening years, my research group has really benefited from being able to use the All of Us database, and have done a number of studies in different areas, including glaucoma, as well as several other eye conditions, including diabetic retinopathy and retinal vein occlusion, um, uh, thyroid eye disease, and so forth. One thing that I had been interested in, as having done public health training prior to going to medical school, was an interest in looking at health disparities and social determinants of health. And again, I think this was something that was a huge benefit of working with the All of Us database. There are specific survey questions around healthcare access and utilization. And subsequent to that, there's also a separate social determinants of health survey. And if you look at electronic health records from routine clinical care, there's a lot of missingness with data regarding social determinants of health. Typically, you'll have things like their insurance information because our EHR systems are primarily designed for billing and to do charge capture, and so the insurance information is often there. But if you look at more granular items like housing security, food security, transportation, education, income, a lot of those things are not captured in electronic health record data from routine care, and certainly for ophthalmology records. We are not as good at as primary care at asking those things and entering that data. And so again, because there are specific surveys around that in the All of Us database, that's another great way to get another dimension of information that's not necessarily available in claims databases or in other EHR data. So that's kind of really been a focus of much of my work over the last couple of years. And again, particularly because a lot of the conditions that we treat day to day, there's huge influence from socioeconomic factors and social determinants. A lot of things that we treat are chronic conditions, and people have to sort of engage in care over time. And so these factors become very important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one study in particular that we did around this. And this was looking at racial and ethnic disparities and cost-related barriers to medication adherence among patients with glaucoma. A lot of this work was done by one of the med students in my lab, Arash Delavar, who's now an ophthalmology resident at Baylor. And so just the background on this, this is from the Surgeon General in the 90s, who basically said drugs don't work in patients who don't take them, echoing, I think Hippocrates, one of the father figures of medicine, who I think was one of the first to observe that, there are difficulties with medication adherence among patients. And it continues to be something that is quite challenging, especially as we have people living longer and have more complex medication regimens and just more things to keep track of. So it's estimated in the US that up to half of the medication is not taken as prescribed. There's huge ramifications from a cost perspective. So if you look at kind of the downstream effects at every step, you have some amount of attrition. And so we write a prescription in the office, or we have, if you look at it from a data perspective, medication orders. But it's tricky because you can't actually know that a patient is actually taking the medication, even if you prescribed it or it shows up as an order for them in the EHR system, because only a subset of those people will fill the prescription at the pharmacy. And then of those, fewer will actually go to the pharmacy to pick up that prescription that was filled. And then of those who actually pick up the medication and take it home, not everyone's taking it properly. So an example for us on in ophthalmology is that people order their eye drops, but they're not able to take it correctly, and they may miss their eye. We do have a lot of older patients, so they may have arthritis and other musculoskeletal problems that make it difficult for them to take their medications. Certainly, a lot of our patients are also in the range where they might have some cognitive impairment or dementia, so they may not be taking a lot of their doses. And then as you go on, you can see in this figure kind of the attrition that happens at each stage. So what are reasons for non-adherence? Forgetfulness is a common one, and again, as our population ages, I think that is an ongoing challenge. Certainly side effects. So if you have side effects from the medication, obviously people are not going to be as inclined to want to take the medication. For glaucoma medications, a lot of them can cause surface irritation. They can cause your eyes to look really red, kind of be uncomfortable, dry. And so because of that, some people, they don't really want to take their eye drops because of those side effects. Some ways that we've tried to address this is using preservative-free formulations, trying to have eye drops that require less frequent administration. But this is a really common thing that we deal with in ophthalmology, but certainly across the board in different parts of medicine. Every medicine will have its side effects, and that is can be a challenge. Complex regimens. Again, we have a lot more people with multiple comorbidities, having to take multiple medications at different times of the day. And it can be really hard as you have people who are dealing with all these different illnesses. For glaucoma, for example, because it is asymptomatic often, and people are saying, well, my eyes don't hurt, and I think I see okay, like because it's, the side of their vision that's involved in the early stages of the disease, and they may not see any impact on their vision. They're saying, I have to take all these pills for my diabetes and my heart disease. And a lot of times, the eye drops don't necessarily get prioritized. And then once they find that they're losing their vision, it's often too late. There's also lack of education or insight into the disease process. They may not know how the disease progresses or what the role of the medication is in preventing disease progression. As I mentioned, be asymptomatic. And then finally, the costs. This is a huge area because, a lot of our ophthalmology medications incur a lot of out-of-pocket costs for our patients, who many of whom, are in the retirement age group and are on fixed incomes. And so when you're looking at a glaucoma drug that's going to cost you $200 a month to take, people do self-ration, and maybe they'll take it every other day instead of every day as prescribed because of the significant costs associated with medication. So that was really one of the areas that we focused in on here. That a lot of healthcare outcomes are related to socioeconomic factors, and unfortunately, in the U.S. there is a lot of variation in how much care costs and also how much healthcare coverage people have. And of course, there are studies that have linked socioeconomic status to race and ethnicity. And so you have these various factors: income, education, insurance status, financial ability to afford transportation to care. And all of these factors will influence how well someone will be able to take their medication, how they can be able to access clinical care, as well as being able to go to surgery and manage the transportation needs after that, and so forth. And of course, their care processes will be associated with health outcomes. So there's this pathway, and I think understanding some of these socioeconomic factors may be as important, or in some cases more important, than understanding the biological factors in terms of risk of disease progression. So again, we looked at the All of Us database, and this was a little further on, so the database is a little larger than when we did our the first study that I mentioned. Again, we honed down on individuals with a glaucoma diagnosis, and then this time we specifically looked at those who had answered the healthcare access and utilization survey. And there are a set of questions that are related to medication adherence, and specifically class-related barriers to medication adherence. And so we basically looked at how they reported those barriers by racial and ethnic groups, with non-Hispanic whites as a reference group. So here you can see both the univariable and multivariable logistic regression. And across the board, looking at populations that were not in the non-Hispanic white group, we really saw this pattern of being significantly more at significantly higher odds of reporting cost-related barriers to medication adherence. The only one where there was kind of like less was the asking for lower cost medication. So even though they were having greater difficulty affording the medication, populations that were non-white were less likely to advocate and ask for lower cost medication to address that issue. So this is just the same results in sort of graphical form, and then just reiterating, the black bars are the reference group, the non-Hispanic whites, and then for these various barriers to medication adherence, that they could not afford medications or they skipped medication because of concerns for money, took less. The gray bars, you can see that the other groups really had higher odds of reporting those concerns or those ways of addressing their medication adherence barriers. So again, if you're interested in learning more about the study, we published this in JAMA Ophthalmology, and here's a QR code if you're interested in learning more. So just to kind of go over again, I know I mentioned some of this as we went along, but really I feel there's so many great strengths to working with data in all of us. One is this ongoing participant engagement. So you're getting growing enrollment over time and new data types that are being added. So when the researcher workbench was first released, for example, there wasn't a social determinants of health survey, and that was added later. We've also done work with the COVID-19 participant experience or COPE survey, and that was a new survey that was added during the pandemic, obviously. And so there's sort of these ongoing additions to the data. Last year the big thing was adding the genomic data, and that was I think another huge opportunity too. I've already mentioned nationwide scope. The size of the database is a huge boon, and then this emphasis on underrepresented populations and ability to study diverse cohorts. The wide range of data types is really great, and I mentioned a lot of those already. I think this is a fantastic way to be able to connect those different areas in ways that you're not able to in a lot of other data sources. Now, in terms of limitations, and this kind of segues into where I see it becoming a little bit, perhaps future improvements. One is that, the user interface is easy to use, but of course the analyses still require some technical or programming expertise. It's basically a Jupyter notebook environment, and there's R notebooks and Python notebooks. But I think, one of the goals, as I see it in the All of Us program, is to expand the pool of researchers who are using the data. And, you might have people who come from, a public health background or other areas where they may not necessarily have, computational experience, but what are ways that we can kind of enable a greater use of the database for people who may not have that programming expertise, or this idea of citizen scientists and people from the community having more ability to work with the data. And so I do think that could be one area, right, in terms of interface development, auto ML, and certainly now with ChatGPT and having like natural language ways of making it easier for people to drum up code and do these analyses. I think that'll be very interesting avenue of future investigation and seeing how we might make the data more accessible. Specifically for us as ophthalmologists, so as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that we look at in terms of trying to phenotype our conditions that are not well represented in the database right now. So visual acuity, which is, like the 20/20, 20/40, these kinds of measurements of how well you see, eye pressure. These are things that are not currently in the researcher workbench, and I think would be helpful in terms of enhancing the database. We are actually, I'm co-leading a work group that is trying to advance the data standards around ophthalmology data elements in the OMOP Common Data Model, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And there's no ancillary testing and no imaging. And again, I think there are some conversations about adding those types of data to the database. And I think one other data category I didn't include here as well was no clinical notes or unstructured text. And again, now with this huge growth in natural language processing, I think that's another opportunity for the future. So yeah, in terms of future directions, opportunities, I mentioned, we're working to try to improve the representation of eye exam data, and not just all of us, but some similar databases that are big data sources that may not include ophthalmology data because of this lack of mapping to standardized terminologies. So the OMOP common data model, which I have a schematic of here, is basically a way of defining the content as well as the structure of data. It's a very common, it's a common data model, but it's been used for multiple data marts, and it's a way of organizing data in a standard way so that you can bring in data from different sources and harmonize it so that a particular variable from one data source is the same as another, and kind of bring it into this common format. And one of the challenges is that in the OMOP common data model, and I would say the underlying source vocabularies as well, like MOINC and SNOMED, there's incomplete representation of some of our eye exam data elements. And so this work group that I'm part of, we have been working to try to fill those gaps and improve standardized representation in the hopes of ultimately improving the representation of our sort of specialized data within these databases in general. And then also, one of the future directions in terms of integrating ophthalmic imaging data, I think will be a huge opportunity as well. And I was fortunate enough to participate in a workshop at NIH a few months ago to talk about, ways that we might be able to accomplish this. And so this is, a picture of the retina. It's a fundus photo of someone with diabetic retinopathy. And I know it's kind of sounds corny, but we all say eyes are the windows to the soul. But it is true that it's amazing what you can tell from a retinal photograph about someone's systemic conditions. You can tell, often it's a reflection of diabetes or high blood pressure. Google did a very interesting paper a few years back where they could tell someone's age and gender based on their deep learning models of retinal photographs. And so there's a lot of information embedded in these photos. One concern is that retinal photos are also used as biometric identifiers. So there's, concern about whether that could be identifying information. And but there are other image types, for example, OCTs, which this is actually a collage picture of my eye made up of component OCT images. So OCT is optical coherence tomography, a quick non-invasive image of the eye, and you actually get individual layers of the retina that you can visualize. And this is something that we use clinically a ton to diagnose and to monitor eye diseases. And it really guides our treatment. And it is not, considered a biometric identifier because it's a cross-section as opposed to this sort of en face picture here. So I think there is, these kind of images could be early biomarkers of systemic disease and aging. There's a potential to look at other therapeutic endpoints across a wide range of conditions. And I think it will help with cohort definitions and phenotyping. And there are discussions about whether to, how we might be able to add this to the All of Us enrollment, because it's very quick and easy to obtain these images, in contrast to some other radiological images, which are very time consuming, expensive, and in some cases invasive. So again, this is kind of some of the content that I presented at the workshop. But I do think that the imaging can really be a step ahead and kind of further improve the database and may pave the path for other areas as well. So I'm going to wrap up there so we have time for questions and discussion. Really thankful to the All of Us research program. This has been, a huge opportunity for me as I was starting my career. When I participated in the demonstration project phase, I was a postdoc, in the middle of my fellowship. And then as I transitioned to faculty, this is really a centerpiece of my research portfolio. And it's been great to be able to work with the program. I've been very fortunate to help with some of the outreach and hopefully connecting with other researchers. And I think as a testament to the reach of the All of Us program. You know, one of the videos that they had me reached 1 million views, which I think is like the only video I've ever did in my last 4 views. So anyway, it's been a great opportunity, and I really appreciate the All of Us program and the participants. Happy to take any questions that y'all might have.
I'd just like to say thanks for that presentation. It was really, really cool, really, really awesome to see. So thank you for at least giving us the time to do that. And yeah, please, any questions, feel free
Sure.
to unmute, or you can also plug them in the chat and we can read them too aloud.